I checked my car's dashcam after noticing the seat was moved. It recorded my fiancée getting out with a guy I recognized. The GPS led me to a motel on the outskirts of the Chicago. When I knocked, I heard her voice say. The first thing I noticed was not the silence in the apartment or the lights being off when they should have been on. It was the driver's seat. The angle was wrong, pushed back farther than I ever set it, tilted slightly toward the wheel in a way that felt unfamiliar. I stood there for a few seconds with my hand on the door, trying to convince myself that I had misremembered my own posture. That explanation lasted about as long as it took for my brain to do the math. I am meticulous with small routines, especially things that come after long workdays. I never changed the seat position. I never let anyone else drive my car. And Isabel had told me that she had not left the apartment all afternoon. The street was quiet, the kind of Chicago quiet that settles in after traffic thins and the city exhales. I slid into the seat anyway, feeling the difference immediately in my knees and shoulders. The mirrors were off too. That detail mattered more than it should have. Adjusting mirrors takes intention. You do not do it accidentally. I turned the key, half expecting the dash to light up with something obvious like a warning or a message that explained everything. Nothing happened. The engine started cleanly, like it always did. I sat there longer than necessary, replaying the day in reverse. Isabel had texted me around noon about being exhausted and staying in. She had mentioned ordering food and catching up on shows. There was no reason to doubt that message at the time. We had been together long enough that small check-ins felt normal and unremarkable. Still, the moved seat refused to fade into the background of my mind. It stayed present, like a grain of sand that would not wash away. The dashcam crossed my thoughts almost as a joke. I had installed it after a minor parking incident months earlier, more for insurance peace of mind than anything else. I rarely checked it. I reached forward, pulled the memory card, and told myself I was only looking to confirm the car had not been driven far. Mileage. Timestamps. Something boring that would let me reset the seat and forget the whole thing. The footage loaded slowly on my laptop once I was back upstairs. Isabel was in the shower, the sound of water masking everything else. I scrubbed through the timeline, watching the familiar angles of my own street pass by. There was the car pulling away mid-afternoon, exactly when I was supposed to be at work. The camera angle shifted as the car turned, and then I saw her. Isabel stepped out of the passenger side first, not rushing, adjusting her jacket with a casual ease that made my stomach tighten. A second later, the driver's door opened, and a man followed. He leaned back into the car for a moment, laughing about something I could not hear, before closing the door with a kind of familiarity that made the scene feel rehearsed rather than spontaneous. He was not a stranger. I recognized him immediately, even though I had not seen him in person in months. Leonard Pike had been a name we argued about last winter. Isabel had framed him as an old work connection who could not take a hint, someone she had cut off because he made her uncomfortable. I remembered the irritation in her voice when she told the story, how she insisted there was nothing there and never had been. Watching the footage now, that version of events collapsed under its own weight. There was no discomfort in her body language. No distance. She moved closer to him, not away. I paused the video and stared at the frozen frame. The timestamp burned itself into my memory. Midweek. Middle of the day. Ordinary enough to blend into everything else. I did not feel anger yet. What I felt was a strange clarity, the kind that comes when a puzzle piece finally clicks into place and forces the rest of the picture to rearrange itself. I continued watching. The car drove for nearly 30 minutes, leaving familiar neighborhoods behind and cutting toward the outskirts of the city. They talked the entire time, their heads turning toward each other in ways that suggested inside jokes and shared context. There was a moment when Isabel reached over and rested her hand on his arm, not quickly or nervously, but with the ease of someone who had done it many times before. I closed the laptop before the footage ended. I did not need to see where they went yet. The point had already been made. The seat was moved because someone else had driven my car. The mirrors were off because that person was not me. And Isabel had not stayed in the apartment all afternoon. The water shut off in the bathroom. I heard drawers opening, the soft clatter of bottles being set down. I moved the laptop back into my bag and reset the driver's seat and mirrors to their usual positions. The motions felt mechanical, almost calm. By the time Isabel stepped into the living room, wrapped in a towel and talking about something mundane, my face had already settled into something neutral and unremarkable. She asked about my day. I answered honestly but selectively, describing work stress without touching the growing weight in my chest. She moved around the apartment like everything was normal, like the afternoon had unfolded exactly as she said it had. Watching her now, knowing what I knew, felt like observing a performance from behind the curtain. Every gesture took on a double meaning. That night passed without incident. We ate dinner. We talked about weekend plans. She mentioned an upcoming meeting that might run late. Each sentence added another thread to a web that was already forming in my mind. I did not sleep much, but I rested enough to function. The next morning, after Isabel left for work, I reopened the dashcam footage. This time I let it play all the way through. The car slowed as it approached a stretch of road I did not often travel. Neon signs and aging storefronts slid past the camera. The GPS overlay marked the destination clearly, down to the street number. A motel appeared in frame, low-slung and anonymous, the kind of place designed to disappear into the background of the city. The car parked near the back. Isabel and Leonard got out without looking around, without hesitation. He placed a hand at her lower back as they walked toward one of the doors. She leaned into the touch. The camera caught them until they disappeared inside, and then there was nothing but an empty lot and the quiet hum of the engine cooling down. I leaned back in my chair and let the implications settle. This was not a first mistake or a lapse in judgment. This was a routine. The timing lined up too neatly with canceled plans and vague explanations from the past year. Meetings that ran late. Errands that took longer than expected. Days when my car had felt slightly different afterward. Details I had dismissed without thinking. By the time Isabel returned that evening, I had already mapped out more than I ever expected to know. I knew the motel's location. I knew the days that matched similar mileage patterns. I knew Leonard's schedule well enough to see how our lives had been running parallel without intersecting. Isabel talked about her day, about office frustrations and minor inconveniences. I listened and nodded, storing each detail away. There was a sense of distance between us that felt new but also overdue, like a truth finally taking up the space it had always required. Later, as she slept, I lay awake and considered my options. Confrontation felt premature. Accusations would give her the chance to rewrite the story, to minimize and redirect. I wanted more than a confession. I wanted to understand the full scope of what had been happening while I planned a future that apparently existed only on my side. The seat being moved had started this, but it would not end there. That detail had opened a door I could not close again. And somewhere on the outskirts of Chicago, a motel room held answers that were no longer hypothetical. By the time the sun came up, I had already decided what the next step would be. I did not rush into the next step, even though every instinct pushed me toward motion. The footage had already rearranged my understanding of the past year, and acting too quickly would only narrow my options. Instead, I treated the discovery like a logistical problem, something that required sequencing rather than impulse. I went to work, answered emails, sat through meetings, and took notes as if nothing had changed. That normalcy was useful. It kept my face neutral and my voice steady while my thoughts worked ahead of me. By late afternoon, I pulled the dashcam file up again and focused on the GPS overlay. The coordinates were precise, time-stamped, and embedded in the video metadata. There was no ambiguity to hide behind. The address pointed to a strip of road beyond the last cluster of chain restaurants, where the city thinned out and the buildings lowered as if preparing to disappear. I looked the place up without digging too deeply, just enough to understand its function. Weekly rates, extended stays, minimal online presence, the kind of business that thrived on discretion rather than reputation. I waited until early evening before driving out, not because I wanted darkness, but because traffic patterns mattered. I wanted to arrive without standing out. The route was familiar now, replayed in my head enough times that I could see each turn before making it. As the city gave way to quieter stretches of road, my thoughts slowed. The urgency from the night before settled into something colder and more deliberate. The motel announced itself with a faded sign and a parking lot that held just enough cars to suggest occupancy without drawing attention. I parked across the street first and watched. That decision paid off almost immediately. Leonard's car was there, angled slightly crooked in a way that suggested it had been pulled into the spot without care. The license plate confirmed what I already knew. This was not a coincidence or a misread of the footage. The timeline was intact. I crossed the street and walked the perimeter slowly, taking in the layout. The rooms were arranged in a shallow curve, doors facing the lot, curtains pulled unevenly across windows that revealed nothing inside. The office sat off to the side, its door open, a television murmuring behind the desk. I did not plan to ask questions, but information has a way of presenting itself when you stand still long enough. A man stepped out of the office carrying a clipboard, his movements unhurried. He nodded at me as if I were expected. That small gesture did more to unsettle me than any overt acknowledgement would have. Familiarity like that implied patterns. I returned the nod and continued walking, counting doors without appearing to count. There were signs of long-term stays everywhere. Folding chairs outside certain rooms. Potted plants that had been watered enough to survive. A stack of mail tucked near one door, names I did not recognize printed across envelopes. This was not a place for spontaneous mistakes. It was a place for arrangements. I sat in my car again and waited. Time passed without incident, which told me more than movement would have. No hurried exits. No signs of disruption. Whatever was happening behind one of those doors was proceeding according to plan. When I finally stepped into the office, I kept my tone even and my request simple. I asked about rates, about availability for a potential extended stay. The man behind the desk did not hesitate. He ran through numbers smoothly, mentioning discounts and policies without prompting. When he referenced repeat guests as a common thing, his eyes flicked toward the lot briefly, then back to me. The implication was not subtle. I left with a brochure I did not need and returned to my car. The conversation confirmed what the footage had already suggested. Leonard was known here. Isabel's presence had not raised questions because it fit into an existing pattern. The realization tightened something in my chest, not because it surprised me, but because it removed the last remaining illusion of rarity. The drive back felt longer than it should have. Each mile added context to moments I had previously filed away as harmless. Dinners postponed. Trips rescheduled. Money shifted between accounts without explanation. I pulled into my own building with the sense that I had been living in overlapping versions of the same week, unaware that one of them excluded me entirely. That night, I did not bring up the motel. I did not bring up Leonard. Instead, I watched Isabel navigate the apartment, her movements efficient and relaxed. She talked about work again, about a project that required coordination with people I had never met. The story was detailed enough to sound convincing, but now I heard the gaps instead of the content. Details can be fabricated. Patterns are harder to fake. After she went asleep, I opened our shared financial records. I had avoided doing that earlier because it felt invasive, but the boundary had already been crossed. I was not looking for proof in the dramatic sense. I was looking for alignment. The numbers delivered exactly that. Small withdrawals on days that matched the footage. Payments that lined up with weekly rates. Nothing large enough to draw attention, nothing sloppy. Careful enough to blend into normal spending. The tempo of events accelerated from there, not because I rushed, but because the information did. Each check reinforced the last. Each date connected to a reason she had given without hesitation at the time. This was not a hidden life built in chaos. It was structured, maintained, and funded with shared resources. The next day, I adjusted my schedule and took time off without explanation. I returned to the outskirts of the city earlier than before, parking farther back where I could see the office and a section of rooms without being obvious. Leonard's car arrived mid-afternoon, right on schedule. Isabel arrived separately this time, parking 2 rows down and walking the rest of the way. That detail mattered. It suggested adaptation, not remorse. They entered the same room as before. No hesitation. No visible tension. Watching them from a distance felt unreal, like observing actors repeat a scene they had rehearsed too many times to forget their marks. I stayed long enough to confirm the pattern, then left before the risk of recognition increased. Back at home, I began making calls that had nothing to do with confrontation. I contacted vendors tied to the wedding under the pretense of clarifying contracts. I reviewed cancellation policies carefully, noting timelines and penalties. I spoke with my bank about account structures, not to move money yet, but to understand how quickly things could be separated if needed. Each conversation was framed as precautionary, but together they formed a plan that no longer depended on emotional outcomes. Isabel noticed none of this. She remained consistent, affectionate in familiar ways, invested in a future that now felt theoretical. I matched her energy without effort, because clarity had replaced confusion. There was no longer a need to search her face for answers I already had. The motel remained a constant in my thoughts, not as a symbol of betrayal, but as a logistical hub. It was the one place where timelines converged and excuses fell apart. Everything radiated outward from that location, connecting lives that were never meant to intersect. By the end of the week, I knew more than enough to act, but I still had not knocked on any door. That restraint was intentional. I wanted the next move to change the shape of events permanently, not just provoke a reaction. The GPS had led me to the motel, but it also led me to an understanding that could not be undone. Whatever happened next would not be about discovery. It would be about consequence. The decision to go back to the motel did not come with drama or hesitation. It arrived quietly, like a conclusion that had been forming long before I allowed myself to recognize it. I chose a time that fit their pattern, not because I wanted to surprise them, but because predictability had become the most revealing part of the situation. This was no longer about catching anyone off guard. It was about confirming how deeply routine had replaced risk. The drive felt shorter this time. Familiar turns came and went without effort, and the surrounding area no longer registered as unfamiliar territory. I parked farther down the lot than before and walked the rest of the way, my steps measured and unhurried. Leonard's car was already there, parked with the same careless angle I had seen days earlier. That consistency settled something inside me. There was no chance element left to blame. I stood outside the room for a moment, long enough to register the sounds coming from within. Movement, low voices, the ordinary noise of two people occupying a space they believed was insulated from consequences. I raised my hand and knocked once, firmly but without force. The sound carried through the thin door, clear and unmistakable. For a brief second, everything inside went still. Then I heard Isabel's voice, close and calm, responding in a way that suggested she assumed the knock belonged to someone else. There was no alarm in her tone, no confusion. What struck me most was the absence of surprise. The response carried the rhythm of familiarity, the kind that comes from repeated visits and an established script. That was enough. I did not knock again. I did not announce myself. I stepped back and walked away before the door could open. Behind me, I heard movement escalate, the sudden scramble that follows delayed recognition. I did not turn around to confirm it. The sound of panic was confirmation enough. By the time I reached my car, my hands were steady. Whatever I had expected to feel at that moment did not arrive. There was no surge of anger or rush of satisfaction. Instead, there was a heavy clarity, the kind that settles after a long argument finally ends without resolution. Hearing her voice had not broken anything. It had finalized what was already fractured beyond repair. I drove away without checking the mirrors, knowing that if either of them stepped outside, I would not be there to see it. That choice mattered. Leaving on my terms preserved something essential, not pride, but control over how the next phase would unfold. Confrontation would have created a spectacle. Silence created uncertainty. The rest of the evening passed in fragments. I returned home before Isabel did, which was expected given the pattern. I moved through the apartment methodically, taking note of shared belongings that would need to be addressed later. Not divided yet, just acknowledged. Every object carried weight now, not because of sentiment, but because of logistics. When Isabel came home, she acted as though nothing unusual had happened. Her voice was steady, her routine intact. The gap between what I knew and what she presented widened with every ordinary gesture. She spoke about traffic, about a delayed meeting, about being tired. Each explanation aligned loosely with the timeline, but none of them mattered anymore. The truth had already been heard through a motel door. That night, sleep came in shallow intervals. I woke often, not from distress, but from mental recalculations. Every plan we had discussed over the past year required reassessment. Not cancellation yet, just repositioning. The wedding existed on paper and in deposits. Our shared life existed in contracts and habits. Untangling it would require precision. The next morning, I began acting on that precision. I contacted the bank and initiated the process of separating accounts under the guise of financial organization. I scheduled consultations that did not require immediate disclosure. I gathered documentation, not as leverage, but as insulation against future complications. Each step was small enough to go unnoticed, but significant enough to matter when combined. Leonard entered the picture again through indirect means. I learned more about his work schedule, not through surveillance, but through publicly available information and casual conversation with people who knew him loosely. Patterns emerged there too. Time gaps. Absences explained away. It became clear that what he and Isabel shared was not hidden because it was rare, but because it was normalized within their separate lives. Isabel sensed a shift eventually, though not its cause. She asked if something was wrong, framing the question lightly, as though prepared to accept a surface-level answer. I gave her one. Work stress. Fatigue. The kind of explanation that closes a conversation without raising alarms. She accepted it readily, which told me more than a confrontation ever could have. The days that followed felt accelerated, not in action, but in consequence. Every interaction now carried an expiration date. I began redirecting communication with wedding vendors, not canceling outright, but delaying confirmations. I reviewed timelines carefully, aware that penalties increased the closer we moved toward the date. This was not about revenge or punishment. It was about minimizing damage to myself while the opportunity still existed. The motel faded from view, but not from relevance. It remained the axis around which everything else turned. That door, that voice, that moment of realization became the dividing line between before and after. I did not need to return. I did not need further evidence. The structure of the deception had revealed itself fully. Isabel continued planning the future with the confidence of someone unaware that the ground beneath her had shifted. She talked about seating arrangements, about travel logistics, about small details that once would have held my attention. Now they registered as data points in a system I was actively dismantling. By the end of the week, the balance had tipped. What began as a moved seat had led to a motel, a knock, and a voice that erased all remaining doubt. The next steps would not involve discovery or confrontation. They would involve outcomes that neither of them could rehearse or control. I had heard what I needed to hear. Everything that followed would be quieter, slower, and far more permanent. After the knock, everything moved forward without any single dramatic moment to point to. There was no confrontation scene to replay later, no raised voices or visible collapse. The damage unfolded through processes, timelines, and paperwork, the kind of mechanisms that keep working long after emotions have burned out. That was the part neither of them seemed prepared for. I started with the wedding, not because it mattered most emotionally, but because it created the widest ripple. I reviewed every contract again, this time with intent rather than curiosity. Venues, catering, accommodations, vendors who had been booked months in advance under joint names and shared accounts. Each agreement had clauses designed for cancellations that were inconvenient, not catastrophic, if acted on within specific windows. I stayed inside those windows. Calls were made calmly. Explanations kept deliberately vague, framed as changes in circumstances rather than disputes. The responses were professional and procedural. Deposits were partially returned. Dates were released. No announcements were triggered, no gossip passed along. The event dissolved quietly, which turned out to be more unsettling than any public scene would have been. Financial separation came next. The bank meetings I had scheduled earlier became practical very quickly. Accounts were restructured. Automatic payments were rerouted. Shared access was reduced in stages rather than abruptly, preventing immediate suspicion while protecting against impulsive decisions on her side. It was not about punishment. It was about containment. The longer this went unnoticed, the more control I retained over the outcome. Isabel noticed changes gradually, not all at once. A card declined unexpectedly. A confirmation email failed to arrive. A vendor stopped responding directly to her messages. Each incident looked minor on its own, the kind of administrative friction that happens during any large planning process. She mentioned a few of them casually, expecting reassurance. I provided it in measured doses, enough to deflect, but not enough to resolve. That imbalance created confusion without alerting her to the cause. Leonard's situation unraveled from a different angle. His work schedule, which had once aligned so conveniently with Isabel's absences, began to attract attention for reasons unrelated to me. Time discrepancies, vehicle usage patterns, missed check-ins that no longer had a buffer. When his employer reviewed internal logs, those irregularities stood out more clearly than before. The motel records did not surface directly, but the behavior surrounding them did. He was placed under review, then suspended pending further evaluation. The process was slow, but its direction was unmistakable. The first real crack appeared when Isabel confronted me about the wedding venue. She had called them directly after failing to get a response through email. They confirmed the date was no longer reserved. She asked how that could have happened. I explained that I had made adjustments based on changing priorities. The phrasing mattered. Adjustments implied intention rather than accident. Priorities implied reassessment rather than crisis. She pushed for more clarity. I did not provide it. That conversation marked the beginning of a shift in her demeanor. The confidence that had carried her through months of duplicity gave way to something more erratic. She asked questions that circled the issue without landing on it. She suggested postponements. She proposed meetings with planners. Each suggestion assumed a future that was already being dismantled piece by piece. The apartment changed too, not in obvious ways, but in atmosphere. Shared spaces became quieter. Schedules drifted out of sync. I began moving personal items into storage under the pretense of decluttering. She noticed some of it, but not the pattern. Patterns require distance to see, and she was still too close to the performance she had been maintaining. When the financial reality finally surfaced fully, it did so without drama. A conversation with her bank revealed limits she did not expect. Support she had assumed was stable had shifted. She came home that evening visibly unsettled, carrying paperwork she did not understand. I reviewed it calmly, pointing out changes that had been made weeks earlier. She asked why. I told her the truth, not about the motel, but about trust being a prerequisite for shared resources. The word hung between us longer than anything else I said that night. Trust did not accuse. It did not explain. It simply existed or it did not. She tried to redirect the conversation toward reconciliation, toward misunderstanding, toward stress and miscommunication. None of those explanations addressed the absence itself. Her family learned what was happening through consequences rather than confession. Questions about the wedding led to answers that were factual and restrained. Financial shifts prompted concern. Patterns they had previously overlooked became harder to ignore when the structure supporting them disappeared. Isabel attempted to control that narrative, but without access to shared accounts or future plans, Her version lacked coherence. The truth did not need embellishment. The logistics spoke clearly enough. Leonard reached out once, indirectly, through a message that framed the situation as unfortunate rather than intentional. He referenced timing, pressure, poor decisions. The language was abstract, carefully avoiding responsibility. I did not respond. Engagement would have given him relevance he no longer had. His problems were unfolding independently now, shaped by systems that did not recognize personal excuses. Housing became the final breaking point. The apartment lease was in my name. That fact had seemed trivial when we signed it. Now it determined the pace of separation. I gave notice formally, allowing time for arrangements without negotiation. Isabel moved out in stages, first essentials, then the rest. Her departure stretched over days rather than a single exit. That prolongation did more damage than an abrupt break would have. Each trip back forced her to confront the reality that the future she had planned was no longer accessible. Months later, the outcomes were clear. The wedding never happened. The shared life dissolved without spectacle, but with permanence. Isabel lost stability, first financially, then socially, as explanations failed to keep pace with consequences. Leonard's employment situation did not recover quickly. Reputations rarely do once patterns replace narratives. I did not emerge untouched. Separation carries its own cost, measured in adjustments rather than losses. But the clarity that followed was real and durable. There was no lingering uncertainty, no unanswered questions waiting to resurface later. Everything that needed to be known had been revealed through ordinary systems doing exactly what they were designed to do. The moved seat had started it. The dashcam had confirmed it. The motel had centered it. The knock had finalized it. What followed was not dramatic, but it was decisive. And when it was over, there was nothing left to reinterpret or revisit. The future did not require explanation anymore. It simply moved forward, unencumbered by a story that could no longer sustain itself.